Ja, jij kondigt aan en ik?
Ik zal Pieter aankondigen.
Oké, super.
Dus, dus we hebben... we wachten nog even op de pre-roll video. Ik zal jou er al uitgooien, Chris.
Ja.
Oké, succes Pieter. Binnen iets meer dan een minuutje na de video gaan we live.
Ja. Zeg jij dat nog, of is dat al?
Ik ben er nog, maar ik heb nu even een tussenslide. Dus die gaat straks weg.
Oké, dan geef jij de cue van...
Ja.
Okay.
Ja. Dus binnen 10 seconden of zoiets. Welcome back to track number 2. And we're here with a colleague of mine from the Netherlands, Pieter de Bruin. And Pieter is going to tell us all about Azure Arc, and specifically the combination of Azure Arc and Kubernetes. Pieter, you have the floor, and really looking forward to this session.
Awesome, thank you, Nick. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting because I started this day, today, 12 hours ago by signing in, logging into the stream, or actually choosing one of 4. So I was an attendee all day, and it sort of feels like weird to be presenting now at the same thing in the virtual reality nowadays, right? Yeah, so as Nick mentioned, I'm Pieter de Bruin. I work for Microsoft, so that's the disclaimer. This is obviously branded. It's the Microsoft view and product. What's probably interesting is that I worked at Docker for 2 years, and a year and a half ago I came back to Microsoft. I worked at Microsoft before. And so ever since I came back, my focus has been on DevOps, containers, and Kubernetes, obviously. And so that's why my interest is also in Azure Arc, and especially the Kubernetes part. And we'll talk about how, what Azure Arc does, and then where the container story fits in. You saw my Twitter handle on the previous slide, so if you want to reach out, feel free to do so. Or otherwise LinkedIn. So key takeaways for today. I think it's good to mention that although it's there's lots of talk about cloud and Azure today, hybrid is a reality. There's lots of reasons why people don't put everything in the cloud. Not only because they may not trust it or have other objections, simply because it's not practical. Right? If you have something that you want to compute on-prem or at an edge location, why would you move it to the cloud and then maybe get the results back? If you can get that closer to where the data is coming from and where it's used, ideally you also use the computer. So that's where we're adding a couple of additions. And so hybrid brings on-prem to cloud, cloud to on-prem, and everything in between. And we call everything in between edge for simplicity nowadays. Arc specifically, the broad umbrella Arc covers servers. So anything Linux, Windows, physical, virtual. That's not covered in this session. I'll touch upon it a little. As we mentioned, the essence is about Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, and then there's going to be additional data services on top of those. And I'll discuss why that's interesting. So the conclusion is innovation anywhere, because once you can deploy from Azure to any Kubernetes cluster anywhere, you're also bringing the innovation anywhere. Ooh, so this is interesting. I'm doing a remote desktop. Let's see if that happens in another time. So as I mentioned, I was a participant and an attendee during the day, and I saw some interesting sessions that may be relevant to you when you're interested in Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Chances are you may be interested in Kubernetes in itself, or Azure Arc in itself, or any of the related technologies like GitHubs. Right. So in short, let's start there. Alessandro Ravozza this morning did a session specifically on GitHubs, which is worth investigating if that is something you're interested in. Then Jorge Valenzuela did another session on Azure Arc, although it was in Spanish. I think you'll get the point if you want to dive into that more. And he had a bit more focus on the server side of things. And then amongst others, Daniel Paulus is doing a session on Azure Policy and Gatekeeper later today, which is also related to the topic. So I think there was good content chosen for today. And this session is only 45 minutes, so I can't cover all of those things in depth. But if you want to investigate a bit more, maybe tune into Daniel later today, or look the recordings of Alessandro and Jorge. Good, so Azure Arc is initially positioned in Microsoft as a hybrid solution. And hybrid is sort of the umbrella of a solution for anyone who wants to move, who wants to do something with their workloads on-prem, but doesn't know what to do yet. Like, can I move straight away to the cloud? Do I need migration tooling? Maybe can I use something on-premise still, or is there something new in between? And so a bit of history. Initially, Azure started with Store Simple. Maybe you remember that. There's a physical appliance that people could use in their data centers to use tiered storage. And later, Azure Stack came along. Also, hardware appliances that provided a bit of Azure in a box. And although those services have their strengths, it's not a solution to all. So with the evolution of cloud technologies, of container technologies with Kubernetes, there's new options. Another reason why you would not do everything in the cloud is, for instance, if you have IoT, right? You have Internet of Things. So think of your home, maybe your lights, or a smart device that you may have. But also think about retailers, right? A physical shop. There's registries. There's hand scanners. There's lots of things that live outside of the cloud, and so not everything lives in the cloud. That's the point. And so we acknowledge that, and we want to provide an option with Azure Arc to also have an answer there. And so in short, what we do with servers is that any physical server or any virtual server, Linux or Windows, you can add to Azure. And we've done that in the past by installing agents, right? And then you had it in System Center tooling. You could manage stuff. Well, System Center is still there, but you could say like the trend has moved on. And so now the modern day single pane of glass is the Azure portal, or ARM with your favorite command line interface, right? Being Azure CLI, PowerShell, the REST API for extensibility, etc. So if you are interested in the way Azure provides functionality, role-based access control, security center, Azure policy, Azure monitor, all those things, if that makes sense to you to apply to all machines, not only those in Azure, but also on-prem in specific location, maybe in branch offices or other clouds or service providers, you can register them in Azure Arc, and you get them in the view in Azure. We'll see that in a bit. And so once you understand that, you're also interested in, hey, but can I do that with Kubernetes? Can I do it with my container clusters? Right, because nowadays containers are anywhere, you could say, right? I'm running in my home. There's a Raspberry Pi who's doing a Pi-hole activity as in a container, and there's lots of other options where you see containers or complete Kubernetes clusters show up, pop up. And so again, if ARM is interesting to you, and with ARM I mean the broader definition of ARM, including robust access control, including tags, including monitoring again, policy, all those things, then why not add your Kubernetes cluster to the central Azure management environment, and then register it there from there, have an overview, see what's going on. And then the cool thing with Kubernetes, as we'll show in a bit, is that you don't only talk about management, but also about application deployment and configuration in there. That's where we'll touch upon GitHubs. Okay, and then lastly, once you have compute, right, so you deploy your website or your microservices solution to a Kubernetes cluster, you also want state. And there's lots of debate about state and containers, because technically you can run a database in a container, right? SQL Server 2017 has been able to do that for quite some years. But also lots of other technologies who were born in the cloud, you could say, were born in containers. They can do that. But containers, well, initially we learned, right, that they shouldn't contain state. They should be stateless. And you don't want to think about backing them up, restoring them again, doing capacity management, scaling up and out. So why don't we, as Azure, provide you with the compute option and the data option, right? So with your logic in Kubernetes, why don't we provide database services? And then the flavors that we're talking about are PostgreSQL for Oracle migrations and SQL, Azure SQL for SQL Server migrations. Right, so Azure Arc, and maybe I already explained a bit too much in the previous slides, but I think it doesn't hurt to cover it again a bit. On the left-hand side, organize and govern across environments. And so this goes for the servers, for the Kubernetes clusters and the data stores. And that is a bit on the compliance side of things, you could say. The initial conversations I've had with customers on Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, they said, oh yeah, I like that the thing about role-based access control and policy and security center. That gives me a feeling of in control. And actually, I, as an application development person, don't get too excited about that, right? I'm more interested in what kind of application scenarios can I do with Kubernetes and containers and the data stores, and not think about stuff that's underneath. Anyway, both are interesting, both are relevant, and I think those things, they go hand in hand with Azure Arc. So they provide a hybrid platform for customers who want that, and they also provide innovation anywhere for people who want to focus more on the app side of things. Maybe another thing to mention here is that their Azure Arc consists of 3 project streams, you could say. So there's Azure Arc for servers. That's been in public preview since the announcement at Ignite in November, I think. So that's, you could just go to the Azure portal and play with it. Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes started its build, so that's 2 months ago, where that was announced in public preview. It was in private preview before that. So you can actually use it, anybody can use it, but it makes sense to work with your favorite Microsoft person to understand what the experiences are, and then also to provide feedback. And then lastly, that's still a private preview, is the data services. So unfortunately, I can't spend too much time on that. It's more on the concepts, on what you could do with it. But we'll have to talk about that at another time when it's more open. yeah, so the benefits of using containers, and this may be sort of a basic slide that you think that you're not expecting here, but my point primarily is about the portability, because once you have clusters, you have a cluster on premise, you have a cluster in Azure, you have a cluster in another cloud. So those three clusters, they can all register to Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, and then they show up in Azure. And now you can do a deployment of an application to all of those three clusters, or one of them, or maybe one unless something happens, and then to another. And that portability, the flexibility of being able to do that, so choosing one cloud or three locations, that is facilitated by the essence of containers. And maybe if you don't know, in short, containers are just your average application, but then they're packaged with all the dependencies. So with their frameworks and with other dependencies, files, binaries they may need. They're created by writing a Docker file. You start with sort of a base image, and that base image you add layers of instructions to it. So after running that recipe, your build is done, and that is where your application is done, plus all of its dependencies. And now you can run it on a developer machine and in dev test QA production, right? That's the storyline we used to have years ago. But now with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, or actually in general GitHubs with Kubernetes, you can deploy it anywhere, wherever your container clusters are. So portability really makes sense in this storyline. What does that look like? I think I mentioned a bit already. So suppose you just have Azure, right? You don't have stuff on-prem, you're only using resources in Azure. So you see there's a VM, and there's app service, and there's a Service Fabric cluster, and Kubernetes cluster, and all the other Azure services. What ARM does, and maybe not everybody understands this or is aware of it, Azure Resource Manager, you know that from the ARM templates, right? Azure ARM actually is an API layer that sits on top of every Azure service, and it adds a couple of things. It provides an API, so you can create a VM or you can create an app service, and then have a client like a portal experience or Bash or PowerShell, where you can invoke those APIs. What the ARM layer does additionally is provide role-based access control, the hierarchy of subscriptions, templates and extensions, tags, policies, things like that. And what's interesting is that customers who are using Azure like those management-related capabilities. And so we're transitioning slides here. And as you can see then, is that Azure Arc ties into that ARM programming model. And so it just abstracts the location away, you could say. So ARM is still there for Azure services, but ARM now is available through Arc to the three services that we discussed: Service, Kubernetes, and Data Services. They can live anywhere, but you can take advantage of the capabilities of ARM. So what does ARM really do? And I think for Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, policy is really the most interesting one. In a bit, I'll show you a demo where I've applied a policy to a resource group. And so the policy and the resource group in effect don't do anything. But what happens if there's a new Kubernetes cluster registered in that resource group, then that policy is applied. And so my policy is you should enforce GitOps. And if GitOps is not enforced, then do it anyway. And so what you get then is having a really simple onboarding experience where you just have to register the external, wherever it is, the Kubernetes cluster, to the Azure resource group, and then that resource group will make sure that the policy is applied. And so it gets its config. And so by creating one command really that does that registers the cluster, you get all that functionality. You actually get a complete baseline, you could say, or even application deployment for that cluster. And so that's the strength of policy. Policy also does continuous checking of, hey, is this still valid? Is this still valid? Is this still valid? And so on. And so if you deviate from the policy, maybe you do something manually to the cluster that the policy doesn't like, right? Like deleting the configuration. The policy will flag that, one, and then two, reapply it. So if you try to hijack a cluster and not have that application running, then the policy will say, hey, this should be effective, and it isn't anymore. So I'll reapply the configuration, and then the config will apply the GitOps functionality, whatever in there. The second thing, GitOps or the configuration, and this is something where we can speak about forever. In essence, and I'll show this to make it even more concrete. In essence, what happened in the past was that we wanted people to use DevOps, right? CI/CD. So you have version control. Once you check in something or you commit something into version control, there's an automatic build that does the continuous integration, and then there's a deployment, CD deployment or release into maybe your Kubernetes cluster. And so automation is great, but the bad thing, of the downside, you could say, is that it is not a continuous thing. So as long as there's regular changes, then the cluster is probably going to be okay. But once those changes stop and the cluster is just going to exist, then it can drift, right? There can be an admin or a developer or whoever has the permissions. They can do manual changes. They can do kubectl apply this file and that file. Maybe even run a manual container, things like that. That may not be what you want. And the interesting thing is that GitOps is sort of fixing that. The essence of GitOps is that you still commit your version control with your application, but then whatever lives in your version control, that's going to be applied. And it's going to be a pull mechanism from the cluster's point of view to make sure that the cluster is in sync or aligned or compliant, or however you call it. And in this case, I have an image that I borrowed from Weaveworks, because Weaveworks have an open source project called Flux that is one implementation of GitOps. There's another, Argo, that also does it. If you want to know more about GitOps, as mentioned, look at Alessandro's session, because that's really that goes deeper, that only covers GitOps. Okay, so the essence is that you can have an application team that commits to repo, and then Flux will pull that in. Now, another advantage of GitOps is that you can have multiple repos with different audiences. Maybe there's an application team 1 in this case, and an application team B or 2. But then there's also the cluster admin, right? Because that's what you see more and more. Application teams may not be fully equipped to maintain a complete Kubernetes environment. And so oftentimes that's split between a platform team or a SRE team or a cluster team, however you call it. And then within that, there's individual teams who get the access to an individual namespace on top of that cluster. And that's the essence of the image here. So there's cluster admins who do everything, and there's individual teams who can do deployments into one namespace. I feel like doing a demo. And we'll get back to the monitoring thing later. So I'm here in a remote desktop session on Windows 10. And in it, I have a Docker environment, right? Docker desktop. And I'm using Windows Terminal, and I've split it between the PowerShell version that does local. You can see kubectl get nodes, Docker desktop, and I have an AKS cluster in Azure that has 2 nodes. And so that is, you could say, a regular AKS cluster, and it shouldn't be relevant. We shouldn't talk about it in the context of Arc, although GitOps also is relevant for AKS. Right? And we're bringing GitOps to AKS, but for now, you can just onboard it as an Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster, and you'll see it in the portal. So as first demo, let's go to this, the Alpine demo. So I have a GitHub repo. You can see here my GitHub username and then ASP core Alpine. In here, I have a default ASP.NET core to something website. Nothing too fancy. You can do much more advanced things, right? You can do even kubectl get deployments. Yes, that works. So I have a demo even of a rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Scott, which is the demo that we used last year at Ignite and Build, that has a .NET API and a Java and a Node and a PHP and Python, because we want to embrace all the programming languages, right? But for simplicity reasons, I've just one deployment, one container or a pod with just ASP.NET Core. So traditionally, what you would do is make a change and then in GitHub Actions have CI/CD. As you see, I have a couple of runs. And what this does is check out, it logs into my registry, it runs a build and a push, and then it sets context, and it deploys to Kubernetes. It updates the image that I'm running in a deployment. Right? And you can still do that, and it's perfectly fine. But the cool thing that you can do nowadays is here. So with Azure Arc, you don't have to push stuff, but you can actually pull it. What I have here is Linux VMs. These live in Azure, and you also see 2 Windows machines actually. Here's one on-prem machine, and what you see with the on-prem machine is nothing much. It's not connected because it's disconnected. It's turned off. But you see that there's policies, so you can apply policies just like the Kubernetes clusters we were talking about: update management, inventory management, change tracking. Right. So those are the capabilities you get with Arc, Arc-enabled VMs. Now with Kubernetes, normally with AKS you have lots of options. Right on the left-hand side, you can look at the pools, like all the nodes that you have, and you can upgrade them, scale, etc. And with Arc-enabled Kubernetes, so this is the exact same cluster, but it's only onboarded as an Arc machine. You don't have all those options. Now this is growing, right? So this list may get longer, but the essence here is that you see that there's a policy. The policies are here. Policies, definitions. Loading, and then if you search for GitOps, you get, I created this custom one earlier in the private preview, but this is the new one. So you get the preview of the deploy GitOps to Kubernetes cluster. So this is a policy, and once you assign this policy to something, right? In this case, I've assigned it to internal Pieter, that's my subscription name, and then /arc_rg is the resource group. So wherever whatever Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster I register to this resource group is going to get this policy. Now, once you look into those, you can see that there's a policy definition, and you see that there's a cluster config. So policy is only make sure that there's a certain config applied, but it's not the actual config, right? So the actual config is here. This is more interesting. There's an instance name, a namespace, a scope, which is interesting because as you saw previous, you can have a GitHubs repo that you point to that you apply to the complete cluster, and you can also give, for instance, for team A, right, or team 1, you can give it the scope to a namespace. So in this case, I could be seen as the operator because I apply to the complete cluster. There's a best practice to make it read-only so that Flux doesn't write back to your Git repo. And then this is the Git repo. And so this is open, right? You can look into this. And actually, I'm a bit ahead of myself. Let's take one step back and look at the other app repo that I have. It's another ASP.NET Core application. And in this case, I also have it built, but this doesn't deploy, right? The whole point is that I commit to my version control and then build something that can be deployed, but it isn't. And as you can see here, I do a build to a certain location and push it, but that's it. So I don't deploy. And so what happens is the Flux logic will deploy, right? Because it has this cluster config, and the cluster config here says cluster apps there's a pod info, and pod info is deployed to the IT ops namespace. So that is one app that I've deployed. Then here's a list of namespaces, IT ops. And so what I can do is just simply copy this, go back, create a new file, teamc.yaml, teamc, commit, no review, no pull request, just commit to master, main. And then, so I've added now the second or third namespace. So in team A, what's in there? There's an endpoint YAML, but it's actually a config map, so we can check that. In team B, I've done my deployment, right? So this is what what the ASP Core 3 app is. It has a load balancer service, and it looks to an ASP Core 3 app, and that is defined in the deployment. And as you can see, this is the same registry where I previously pushed the image to. One additional thing, if you're deploying outside of AKS, right, you're deploying to something else, like I have in this case, Docker Desktop Kubernetes cluster, then you need image pool secrets because ACR is secure by default, so it doesn't allow anonymous repos. So you have to provide the secrets in some way. Other than that, this is default, it's standard. Okay, so now let's look at some code. Here you see kubectl namespaces. The exact same definitions that you saw previously, right? So ASP Core Alpine, this is where I do the CI/CD push to. Azure Arc is needed for Azure Arc itself, and then cluster config. We've configured this, right, to run the config that we're running, but you can have multiple configs. So Azure Arc is sort of the core agent, you could say, and then cluster config is in this case just one instance of configuration. It can be more. Default is default, gatekeeper something else. IT ops is the one that has the pod info deployment, and then there's team A with the config map, right? kubectl get all namespace team A. There's nothing, but only config map, and then the same get all for team B. There we go. So that's where the deployment is, right? There's pods, there's a service with the public IP, there's the deployment and the replica set. what would be cool if you could actually see the Git namespace with the team C. There we go. Right, so I wasn't watching it, but 8 seconds ago you see the team C was added. So, and this is the sort of the simplest deployment you can do with Kubernetes, but you get the point, right? You get the point that I can make a change in the Git environment, and I don't do kubectl apply something here. I don't make manual changes to this thing. The way Alessandro explained it earlier today is that with everything as code, you also want everything version controlled. And now if I break something, maybe someone does it intentionally or it happens unintentionally, what you need is just get back to your cluster environment, and normally you would have that as infrastructure as code, right? And then also the deployment of your application is a matter of setting the config and the CI/CD or the GitOps operator, in this case Flux, will just pull that config over itself. As I mentioned, I'm running a Windows 10 machine that also has Docker Desktop. Right? So this is Docker version 1903 something. It's running Linux and it does Kubernetes also. Because if you don't know, if you're used to Windows, Docker Desktop is probably the easiest way to get started with with Kubernetes, and also have the option for to run Windows containers. So I can do kubectl here as well. Other nodes I have at the top, right? There's one node, it's just this box. And if I do namespaces, I get the same response. It has Azure Arc, it has cluster config, it has the Docker namespace, because that's what the technology brings. The ITOps thing, and then team A, B, and C. And C is 94 seconds ago. Team B it could also be applied, right? So kubectl get service team B, and you see that it's deployed to localhost, right? So I can now look at localhost and then browse the website here. I think I have it open somewhere. This is the topic IP for the AKS cluster, right? This is the localhost. What else did I want to show? Right. I think we left off with the monitoring part. And so let's look at that. Because we were looking at Azure Arc, and you believe that the AKS cluster can be monitored, right? Because that's just default behavior of AKS. So now I'm looking at AKS, and sure, it does monitoring, but that's what we're used to. We're sort of spoiled that way. But this is the Docker Desktop environment. And so this is really interesting, I think. Because yes, this machine lives in Azure, but it's not registered in any way to Azure. I'm not looking at it from a VM level, but I'm looking at it from a Kubernetes cluster level. And so what's new, relatively new, is yes, I have configurations. It's installed, right? You see it here. Last applied 10. There's policies. It's compliant with the policy, and you can dive into that more. But what I also find interesting is that you can look at this cluster now from a management point of view and see how things are working within a Kubernetes cluster on Docker Desktop on your Windows 10 machine. And so yes, you see the Docker Desktop node and it's doing something. It looks pretty okay. No crazy things. Oh yeah, and then so also log analytics. So not only right. I just wanted to say I checked this, and then so you don't want to go to API management services, right? You want to go to the Kubernetes section. Kubernetes. So container lifecycle information, image inventory, container memory, maximum disk, container CPU. Let's look at that. So you see all kinds of measurements, continuously ongoing. What else did we have as? the sample queries. Where's Kubernetes? Here it is again. Container insight, billable data, rich node, memory usage, things like that. Readiness status per node. It's always ready. Yes, and then you can also do charts, obviously. Right, so what you've seen now is those. Let me look at my demo notes. If I've shown all the things I wanted to show, insights logs, GitHub, cluster config. Yeah, and the last thing maybe is to make a change to the running web app, right? Here you see web action 19, and here's also web action 19. And so when I do change in this code for HP Core 3, web, I can do it here, and then obviously you'd ideally have to commit the change and then also have an updated tag for your container image. My demo isn't that far. So now I made a change to the application. It should show action 20. Let's see if the action is running. It is. There's a build job. This is relatively fast because it's running on a dedicated machine. 11, 12, 12, 12, push. Yeah, it's all there. Right, so now the container is updated. Here, go to registry, container registries, repositories, HP Core 3. Here you see it was last updated just now. And I have to do a dirty trick to deployment. Yeah, so that is all running. I have to force really the flux pool. So if I now delete this thing, the pod, it should be, the latest config should be pushed, forced really. Go, delete it. And then you see it's running again. Let's see if that worked. That was local, right? There you go. So the change now is 20. And so the change is not shocking, but I'm almost happy that it works. Yeah, so what happens is that there's a push from CI to the registry, and then the cluster config, come on, in team B gets that latest definition, and it's looking at latest, and latest should be improved, but it works for now. And so as soon as the pod falls over, it pulls the the latest version of the image and then updates it. Yeah, I think that's about it. Let's go back to the slides briefly. There's a few more. We covered this. We covered Azure Monitor. Lots of sources go into the metrics as well as the logs. I wanted to make that clear. Yeah, so Azure Data Services. You've seen now that there's a way to look at Azure Kubernetes Service as a way to run your containers, right? With an application in a container. But once you look at Azure Kubernetes Service as sort of a location where you can deploy existing Azure services to, like Azure SQL, Azure PostgreSQL, then all of a sudden it becomes a real interesting platform. And I'm not going to get carried away, but use your imagination and see what else is going to arrive at that location. right? So for now, let's just wait for the private preview to be over and have additional data services on top of Kubernetes that you can use, so that you don't have to run your own database next to your Kubernetes cluster, but in your Kubernetes cluster and then managed by Azure. And so that's going to take away at least one headache that many customers have. But once you have that, you can also think of additional concepts. Here's another technical thing that shows where there's custom resource providers at the ARM level for servers, for Kubernetes, and for data. And so, in server you run an agent, and in Kubernetes you run an agent, and so in data services you run an agent. I think you get the point. Server admin tools here. This is a big emphasis that we're using Kubernetes native tools. But for instance, for the databases, we can use Azure Data Studio. There's much less need of listening to the open source community in that sense. So hopefully this got you excited a bit. You learned something about Azure Arc, about how hybrid is really, really relevant, how it's going to be interesting to look at servers and Kubernetes and data services later on. And then lastly, it's going to bring Azure innovation anywhere. We just have to wait a bit, and that can be a challenge sometimes. There's lots of news since built on this, especially for Kubernetes, so lots of interesting things to look at. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to talk about this, to work with customers on this. In the end, that's what I do. And I think that's all for my content. Maybe let's ask Nick to see if there's anything on Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Pieter. Actually, there's a question if people can get access to the links in the slides. So I think the links to GitHub repos and the demos that you've shown. If you could share those as well, maybe here in chat, so other people that are looking at this can also pick those up.
Yes, absolutely, and I'll be active on Twitter later today or tomorrow to also share that content. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Just quickly browsing here. I can't see any specific questions. So no, we're good. In terms of in you visiting your customers, how do you see kind of people looking at Azure Arc? Is that something that gets a lot of traction right now from customers? What are kind of the typical reasons why people are looking at Arc?
Yeah, correct. So I think servers, they make sense. They've been around for longer, and the technology is not that, how do you say it, that much changing. So that's sort of self-explanatory. For Kubernetes, that's a bit different because in general, containers and Kubernetes are still new, at least in many minds of enterprise architects and CIOs. So there's lots of evangelization, you could say, or enablement to do there. But then also there's so many offerings in the area of Kubernetes around that everybody is thinking about, hey, how can I make most of this in my case, right? And I mentioned retail as an example, where with IoT it makes a lot of sense, but in manufacturing with factories it also does. And I think those two are the most interested and active now.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I think if there's no further questions, the only thing that remains to be said is thanks a lot for this interesting session and this view into Azure Arc in combination with Kubernetes. It was really
cool.
Really interesting. Thanks a lot, Pieter, and hope to see you soon. For people, if you still have questions later on, feel free to post them in chat, or as Pieter mentioned, you can reach out on Twitter. So stay in touch, and thanks a lot for joining this session.
For everyone who is upskilling this staycation, we have something very special. The Summer Learner Badger. and you can earn one for joining this event. Scan the QR code, which will appear on your screen, and claim your badger. Azure Heroes is a Microsoft program for recognizing community efforts.